So I'm going to start my message this morning with a very short story, a 30-second story. And it's about a man whose town begins to flood. Okay, so here goes. A man's town begins to flood. As the water starts rising around his house, he knelt down and prayed. Lord, please save me. Not long after, a lorry drove past. And the driver of that lorry called out and said, "Come on, get in. I'll get you somewhere safe." But the man shook his head and said, "No thanks. I'm trusting God. He'll save me." The water kept rising. And a while later, a boat came past with people in it. And the people in the boat shouted out, "Why did you get in? We can get you somewhere safe. There's still time." But again, the man refused. "No, it's all right. God will save me." Eventually, the water rose so high that the man had to climb onto the roof of his house. And just as he was on the roof of his house, a helicopter came over and threw down a rescue rope. "Grab the rope. You can get in. We'll get you somewhere safe." No, God will save me. The water kept rising, and sadly, the man drowned. And when he arrived in heaven, he asked God, "Lord, I trusted you. Why didn't you save me?" And God replied, "I sent you a lorry. I sent you a boat. I sent you a helicopter. What more were you expecting?" Church, sometimes we're asking God to speak, but we're not noticing the ways that God is. And that brings me to the title of my message this morning, Hearing God's Voice. For many of us, that phrase might bring about some different thoughts. It might bring about, our thoughts thinking about dramatic stories like a burning bush, like a loud voice from heaven, or those powerful moments where God speaks in unmistakable ways. And of course, we do read about those throughout the Bible, don't we? We see moments like that in Scripture. But very often, hearing God's voice is much quieter than we might expect. And actually, it's something that grows out of relationship, isn't it? It grows as we walk with Him, as we spend time with Him, as we learn to recognise the way that He speaks into our lives. Because at the heart of our Christian faith is this beautiful truth that God is not distant, God is not silent. Our God is a God who speaks. He speaks through His Word, He speaks through His Spirit. He speaks through prayer, He speaks through worship, He speaks through the wisdom of others. And sometimes He speaks in those quiet moments where something is stirring gently within our hearts and we sense that God is drawing our attention to Him. And learning to recognise His voice is part of the journey of our faith, isn't it? Just like in any relationship, recognising someone's voice comes through knowing them well. The more we spend time with someone, the more easily we will recognise the way that they speak, the more easily we recognise their voice. Parents in the room, I bet you could pick out your child's voice in a crowded room just like that. A close friend could recognise your voice on the phone within seconds. And someone who loves you can tell there's something wrong with you just by the tone of your voice. Recognition grows through relationship. And in the same way, when we grow in our relationship with God, we begin to recognise His voice more clearly. But sometimes that begins with something very simple, doesn't it? It begins with slowing down. And the Bible reminds us of this in Psalm 46, where we read the words, "Be still and know that I am God." Be still and know that I am God. That invitation to be still is simply an invitation to pause, to quiet our hearts, to become aware of God's presence with us. Because Because when we slow down enough to notice, we begin to realise something really quite surprising. God has been speaking all along. And the Bible is full of accounts of people learning to recognise God's voice. Not people who had everything perfectly together or figured out, but people who were discovering what it meant to hear when God called their name. And that's something many of us are still learning even today. And that's okay. So what does it mean to hear God's voice? How do we recognise it in the middle of our everyday busy lives? And how do we respond when we sense that God is speaking to us? How do we respond? You see, hearing God's voice doesn't always look the way we want it to. Hearing God's voice doesn't always look the way we expect it to. For most of us, it's not going to be through a burning bush. It's not going to be a loud voice from heaven that stops us in our tracks. More often than not, God's going to speak to us in ways that are quiet and personal and easy to overlook if we're not paying attention. And sometimes he speaks through his word, where a verse suddenly jumps out of the page and it's like it was written for that exact moment in your life. Have you ever had that? Yeah. It's called a rhema word. Other times, he speaks through his spirit, through a gentle nudge in our heart, an encouragement to pray for someone, to reach out, to forgive, or to take that step of faith. But he also speaks through other people, perhaps in conversations that you've never expected to have. And sometimes recognising God's voice is less about hearing something new and more about noticing what he has already been saying all along. But before we get into that, I want to take you back to a memory of mine that God brought to my attention not that long ago. Well, less than a year ago, anyway. Because about a year ago, less than a year ago, I was asked to bring a short devotion at my final ministry training conference. And not long after that, I was invited again to share it at Elim's Evangelism Conference. So if you were there and you've heard this, I do apologise, but I think it's worth another share. So, when I first started preparing for this, I prayed and I asked God, what is it that you want me to bring to a room full of people who are training to be ministers? Because I didn't have a clue what I was going to bring. In fact, I was quite nervous about it. I thought I'd got away with it. You see, Brad got through his years not being asked to do anything. Nothing. Nothing, he got away with it. In the 3 years that I've been training, I've been asked to do quite a few things. And this was one that I really didn't want to do, but I did anyway. But I did what we all do before we prepare something. I prayed. And I said, God, what is it that you want me to say to a room full of people who are training to be ministers? And for a while, the answer seemed to be silent. You know, when you pray and you expect God to speak with clarity, and instead you're met with that awkward silence. That's where I found myself. But then one morning I was here in church, and I'd managed to shut off all the noise of my busy life, and I just wanted to worship God. And I was praying in that time, just saying, Lord, if you want to speak to me, then speak to me. If there's something that you want me to bring, then speak to me. I just want to worship you. And in that time of worship here in church, it came to me. And it was just one word, and it was very simple. And it was this. Listen. Listen, Lord? Is that it? Really? Tried to negotiate. I thought God might have needed just a little bit of help, because I'm thinking, maybe it'd be better if we spoke about perseverance, Lord. These are ministers in training after all. Or maybe we should speak about boldness, because we all know we've got to be bold. Or better still, why don't I speak about being mission-minded? Because ministers in training need to realise that you also need to be mission-minded. I mean, surely everyone that I'm going to be speaking to is already going to be listening, right? But the word came back. No. Listen. And that's when I was taken back to when I was a child and I spent the summer holidays with my nana and granddad. And, you know, life for me growing up, and I'm not trying to get a sympathy vote here, but life for me growing up was very different to other children my age, and my home life was loud, it was chaotic, it was the kind of home where peace and quiet and stability were more like rumours than reality. I would appreciate that and all, but never mind. But when I went to stay with my nana and granddad, then everything changed. They lived near the sea, Fleetwood. Not costed us all. Just so you know. But when I went to stay with them, their home felt like this little bubble of calm. And it was like someone had pressed pause on the noise of all the chaos of the life that I was living in. And for a while I could breathe. And I could feel safe. And every day that I spent with my nana and granddad, and I spent the whole 6-week holidays there, it didn't matter what the weather was like. Every day that I was there, my nan would walk me to the beach. And it was about a mile from their house. It was a mile there and a mile back. And no matter what the weather, she would just say to me, the sea air will be good for you. Have you ever heard that? The sea air will be good for you. Well, I'm not convinced that the sea air was always good for me, because I'll tell you something. On a windy day, when you're walking down the seafront, and that sand whips your legs, it hurts, right? It hurts. And I always had shorts or a skirt on, don't know why. Didn't matter what the weather was like, and that sand would whip my legs and it would really hurt. But those walks with my nan on the beach, they were the best. They were full of adventure and peace and joy and all of that things. And I used to lift up rocks to find the crabs underneath, and my nan would scream and run off, and we'd paddle in the waves if it wasn't too cold. Remember, this is Fleet, not costed us all. And we'd collect shells. And when I say collect, I mean like on a professional level. I was a professional shell collector. My poor granddad, Nana and Granddad's house looked like a miniature version of the seaside gift shop by the end of the 6-week holidays, trust me. And, well, my granddad was probably wearing shell suits before they were even a thing. But one of those days, walking along the beach, my nan picked up a shell that was different from the rest of the shells that I was collecting. And she called me over, and she said, "Come here, Adelle." She used to call me Adelle. "Come here, Adelle." Got a shell, just for the effect. And I've also got a slide that looks just like this shell. She said, "Come here, Adelle. Put this on your ear and tell me what you can hear." So I was so busy collecting shells and thinking about what was under the next rock that I didn't really pay attention. So I just did this. Can't hear anything. Can't hear anything. And she grabbed me by the shoulders and she looked me in the eyes and she said, "No, listen. Stop talking," which was impossible. "Be still," which was even more impossible. "And listen." So I paid attention, took hold of the shell, and I put it to my ear. And there it was, the sound of the ocean in the shell. It was amazing. That shell, small enough to hold in my hand, carried the sound of the ocean within it. Something so small could carry something far greater than itself. Of course, now I know, I'm a grown-up now, not a child anymore. I know the seaside is not in the shell. But how incredible is it that something so small can carry something so great when you be still and listen? I thought that was amazing. From that day on, no matter where I was, no matter what was going on in my life as a child growing up, no matter what chaos was going on, I knew that if I just picked up a shell and put it to my ear, it would take me right back to the peace of walking on the beach with my nan. And when I remembered that moment, that day here in church, it was like it was all just flashing before my eyes. And it was like, you know when you think about so much, but you think about so much in like milliseconds because God's just brought it to your attention. That's what it was like. And when I was thinking about that memory, it struck me. God's voice is often like that, isn't it? He doesn't always interrupt. He doesn't always shout. More often than not, His voice is like the whisper of the waves in the shell. It's there. You just have to pause. You just have to be still. You just have to stop talking, and for some of us that might be impossible, and listen. And sometimes that's not easy. We need to shut off what's going on in our lives. We need to pause, we need to be still, and we need to listen. Something else I've learned about shells, I'll share it with you, because I can, because I've got the microphone. But I've learned that the shell doesn't create the sound. It simply amplifies what's already around. And in the same way, when we position ourselves and our hearts to really listen to God, His voice will become clearer. Why? Because it's already around us. And that reminds me of the story of Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 3. And God calls him at night. Samuel, the young boy, is lying down in the temple, and in the middle of the night he hears a voice call his name. Samuel. And like any good apprentice, he jumps up and he runs straight to Eli and he says, "I'm here, you called me." And Eli says, "I didn't call you. Go back to bed." And this happens 3 times. 3 times Samuel hears his name being called. 3 times he runs to the wrong person. 3 times he assumes that the voice must belong to someone he already knows, that it must belong to Eli. Until he realises, Eli this is, that something special is happening. Actually, it's God speaking to Samuel. And so he says to Samuel, "Go back. Go and lie back down. And when you hear him call you again, this is how you should respond. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And from that moment on, after Samuel responded in that way, he began a life of hearing and carrying the word of the Lord. But the story of Samuel doesn't just begin with a boy lying down in the temple and hearing a voice in the night. It doesn't begin there. There's so much more going on around that moment, isn't there? If you know the story of Samuel, you'll know that he is a miracle child, that his mother Hannah had longed for a child for years. And in a culture where having children was tied to identity and honour, Hannah carried this deep anguish within her, being unable to conceive a child. And so one day in the temple, she prayed with such desperation and such honesty that actually Eli the priest thought she was drunk. She wasn't drunk. She hadn't been drinking. She was just pouring out her heart before God. And God answered her prayer. Samuel was born because God heard the cry of a faithful woman. Hannah prayed that if God gave her a son, that she would dedicate him to serve the Lord for his entire life. And she kept that promise. She kept the promise that she'd made to God. And when Samuel was still very young, she brought him back to the temple. She dedicated to the Lord's service. And I just want you to imagine that for a moment today on Mother's Day. Just imagine that, mothers, grandmothers, sisters, women. God has blessed you with a child that you've longed for years, and then you hand that child over to go and live away from you eternally. And that's what happened. Samuel grew up in the temple, learning the rhythms of worship, watching sacrifices being made, seeing the priest Eli carry out his daily duties. His whole life was surrounded by the things of God. But even though Samuel lived in the temple, even though he was surrounded by spiritual activity, even though he was serving in the house of God, he still didn't know how to recognize God's voice. 1 Samuel chapter 3 verse 7 says, "Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him." So he lived in the temple, he served in the house of God, he was surrounded by worship, sacrifices, spiritual activity. His whole life was surrounded by the things of God. And actually what I want to tell you is that means more than you might think. That means more than you might first realise, because environments shape our hearts. Long before we understand what's happening, environments shape our hearts. Day after day, Samuel watched worship. He heard prayers, he saw sacrifices. He lived where people came to meet with God. All of those moments were quietly forming him, preparing him, teaching him the language of faith before he even recognised the voice of the one who worshipped. Long before Samuel understood what God's voice sounded like, his life was already being shaped in a place where God was known and honoured. God was speaking before Samuel understood. And he didn't wait for him to have it all figured out. He just simply called his name. Church, that is the same for us today. He calls our names too. Not always loudly, not always dramatically. Sometimes it's gentle, sometimes it's quiet, and sometimes it's in ways that we might miss if we're not paying attention. Which brings me to the words of Jesus in John chapter 10. My sheep listen to my voice. I know them and they follow me. I love this because Jesus uses the image of a shepherd and the sheep. Now I think sheep get a bit of a bad reputation. Okay? I'm just going to pull it out now. They get a bad reputation because people think that sheep are stupid. But you haven't met my dog Dave. Dave is stupid, okay? Actually, sheep are incredibly good at one thing. They know the voice of their shepherd. They're incredibly good at that. In the Middle East, in those times, shepherds would bring their flocks into a shared sheepfold. So, several flocks belonging to different shepherds, all together in one sheepfold. I mean, for us, put our dogs in somewhere like that, that's chaos. I'll just give it out there. Dave would just be daft. But these shepherds, they were incredibly good at knowing the voice of their own shepherd. And these sheep would be kept there overnight, and in the morning when the shepherd wanted to get his sheep back, he would go to the gate and he would call his sheep, and his sheep would come to him. But the sheep belonging to the other shepherds, they wouldn't move because they didn't recognise the voice of that shepherd. Jesus says, that's what my relationship with you is like. My sheep listen to my voice. That's what he says. He doesn't say occasionally hear me, which is probably what my dog Dave does. He just occasionally listens. Or I don't know where the brain cells are going with him, but yeah, that's what it's like with him. Actually, what he says is, they know my voice. So there's a relationship there, isn't there? There's recognition. And then Jesus adds something even more beautiful than that. You know what he says? He says, I know them. Before we even talk about us hearing him, he tells us that he knows us. He knows our fears, he knows our doubts, he knows our questions, he knows the chaos that's going on in our lives, he knows the noise that's going on in our heads, he knows the busyness that fills our days. He knows it all, church. And he still calls our name. And then comes the completion of this verse, the final bit. And they follow me. Church, listening always leads somewhere. It leads to trust, it leads to obedience, it leads to movement. And our Christian life isn't just about hearing God's voice, it's about responding to it. Samuel didn't just hear God. He said, speak, Lord. And then he listened, and then he obeyed. And Jesus says the same to every single one of us. My sheep listen, I know them, and they follow me. And I guess that's the challenge for us today, isn't it? In a world that is constantly talking. We've got notifications going off, we've got social media, we've got deadlines with work and things like that. The news, there's lots going on in the news right now. There's responsibilities, there's just voices everywhere, isn't there? But when was the last time we truly stopped to listen we paused and in the stillness just simply said, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." See, it's that kind of stillness where we hold the shell to our ear and we quiet the noise long enough to hear the whisper of the waves. Because the voice of our good shepherd is still speaking today, church. He's still speaking through his word. He's still speaking through his spirit. He's still speaking through those gentle nudges in our hearts. So the question is definitely not, is God speaking? Because we know the answer to that, don't we?
Yes.
The question is, are we listening? So maybe the prayer that we need isn't a long and complicated one. Maybe the prayer we need is just simply 4 words. Speak, Lord, I'm listening. So as I come to a close, I want to take us back just one more time to that moment on the beach with my nan. A small shell and a moment of stillness. And a sound that is much bigger than the shell itself. It was always there. I just had to slow down long enough to listen and hear it. And when we look across the whole Bible, we can see that God has always been a God who speaks. He's always been a God who speaks to his people. From the very beginning of Genesis, we can see God spoke creation into existence. Let there be light, and there was light. So the world began with the voice of God. And that same God who spoke the universe into existence continues to speak to us today. And he continues to speak throughout history. He's always been speaking. He spoke to Abraham and called him to leave everything familiar. He spoke to Moses through a burning bush. He spoke through the prophets. Again and again, the Bible reminds us that God speaks. And what this does also is when we look at ways that God has spoken, it also reveals this powerful truth. Hearing the voice of God is not always something that happens when we're alone. Samuel needed Eli to help him recognize what was happening. The early church prayed together. Paul surrounded himself with other believers who encouraged him, corrected him, and confirmed God's direction to him. Sometimes, church, we need people around us who will pray with us, who will walk with us, who will help us to stay attentive to the voice of God in our lives. Because when we gather together to worship, to pray, to study, to encourage one another, that's when we create spaces where it becomes easier to notice the way God is speaking. Because sometimes the clearest way to hear God's voice is when we listen together. And I think that's what God is inviting us into today. Not to feel pressure that we've somehow missed the voice of God. Not to feel condemned by it. But to simply begin again with a quiet heart. To pause, to make space, and to say, "Speak, Lord, I'm listening." Because our good shepherd still calls his sheep, and his voice is always worth listening to.